Hey everyone, this is Craig here, and you know the drill. At the top of the episode, I give some announcements, and today I have a very important one, especially if you are going to be in New York City on November 9th. Stuart Kendall, whom you probably remember from our episodes on Bataille, Nietzsche and communism, and also most recently our episode on Artaud, has agreed to do an event with us at the Durations Festival in Brooklyn, sponsored by Public Records. We're still hashing out the details, but things seem pretty firmed up at the moment, so please save the date. That's November 9th. Also, we will be having an event in State College, Pennsylvania on September 15th with Josh Retzel, and we will be talking about Hegel and the coolness of the absolute. Yes, Acid Horizon doing more live events. If this is the kind of thing that you would like to see done with our podcast, please subscribe, support us. That's how these things get to happen. And once you do, then you'll be able to join our reading groups, like our new reading group on Klossowski and Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle. Go ahead to the show notes right now and subscribe at the $5 level. Then you can take advantage of everything that we have to offer. And you can feel good about, hey, I am supporting public philosophy. I'm supporting independent research and scholarship. And so many of you have already done this, and I just want to say thank you. Okay. Today, we are covering Byung-Chul Han, a critical introduction out on Polity Books, and we have the authors, Stephen Knepper and Robert Wyllie. So let's head on over to that conversation right now.
Welcome back to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. And today, I don't know why I said podcast with American accent, but today, that's part of Control Society, folks. Today, we are going to visit a thinker who thinks about the contemporary confines of control and the way in which we end up controlling ourselves in the decay of so-called disciplinary society. The discipline, the cop, is now within our own heads. And indeed, as Deleuze once said, we are stuck in a perpetual cycle of training, retraining, and reconfiguration of ourselves to fit the needs of the market. Now, we've been talking about this for years, but one of the key thinkers in this kind of tradition that we haven't even really spoken about much, of course, is Byung-Chul Han. And today we're going to rectify this grave injustice of control theory by being joined, of course, by Stephen Knepper and Robert Wyllie to talk about the book that they put together with Ethan Stoneman, which is, of course, Byung-Chul Han, A Critical Introduction, which is out now with Polity Press. Rob, Steve, thanks for joining us. So just as a kind of a rudimentary introduction to ask you both, so who is the philosopher Byung-Chul Han, and what is it about his work that you both find so compelling, such as we need to bring forth not just an introduction to his work, but a critical introduction that tries to evaluate the impact of his ongoing influence today?
Sure. So Byung-Chul Han has about 30 books. Now I think he's up north of 30 books. Many of them are quite short, essay length, opuscule kind of books. But he's been writing on a huge range of topics, some more scholarly, often at a more popular kind of interventionist level, since the late 90s. And often there are threads between these books or connections between these books that you're not going to have explored unless you try to lay them all out in a sort of critical introduction. So this will be the first book-length treatment of Han in English, but I think also in any language, the first kind of critical introduction like this. So often you, as an academic, you have to justify a book. You know, why do we have yet another book on Spinoza? Something else I'm working on, not the first book there. But with Han, it is, fortunately, we're in the good position where we get to break ground, point out some of the consistencies in his thought. I think especially with Han, he can be so brusque with contemporary interlocutors that objections to him, he is very fancy-free with overstatement, and that's quite on purpose, we think. And so you might put down one of his book on the pandemic or his book on technology, Burnout Society, whatever it is, and you'll come away, like many of our students come away with it, right? Critical of him. And sometimes those, people have good reasons to be critical of him, but often there's sort of a longer story, or there's more of an argument that's sort of missing. It's in another book. So we're just trying to cover the waterfront and give a sort of map so that as there's more uptake of Han popular level, of course, but among academics and among writers, people can do him justice even if they're trying to criticize him.
Yeah, I think one thing I would add is that Han is certainly one of the contemporary thinkers that's trying to address technology, the digital, how it's affecting us, in a way that's not only philosophically rigorous, but in a way that, just regular readers that might be sort of feeling like, hey, I'm struggling with screen addiction, or boy, it seems like the political conversation isn't including all of these things around AI or data harvesting or, surveillance capitalism. Why is it that this isn't on people's radar? Where can I learn more about it? I think Han, the short book thing is easy to criticize, but he said in an interview with a Korean newspaper that he wrote his longer, more scholarly tomes early in his career. Some of those haven't been translated. Hopefully they will be. But he really takes seriously this vocation of the philosopher to try to speak to where people are and help them understand their moment. That drew me to Han.
I mean, I think this paradigm of the short, incisive philosophy book that's meant to respond almost as quick to something in the everyday, particularly in the era of the fast circulation of digital information, that's definitely something worth picking up on. I mean, we used to do a lot of work with Zero Books. I mean, that's kind of, they took that model and ran with it. Let's be honest, so did Mark Fisher. I've got a book on data economy and what it's doing to us with Zero Books out in this winter, and it's not exactly a 1,000-page tome. I mean, there's also that line from Kant that philosophy books would be shorter if some of them weren't so short. And we can think of, you can go through 1,000 pages of Less Than Nothing by Zizek and you come out of it learning far less than you might have of about 100 pages of, I'd say, even someone like Mark Fisher. And I think the brevity of it really does speak to the kind of the medium being the message in terms of the speed in which we consume philosophical content. Speaking of course, consuming philosophical content, we do have a Patreon, like and subscribe. But in all seriousness here, one of the sort of ways in which he does reach out to people in their sort of immediate life circumstances is probably through one of his most famous books, which is The Burnout Society. Can we get into what this concept of burnout means for Han, and particularly how it relates to the wider sense in which he's talking about a shift in our patterns of social existence, namely the rise of digital and its correlation with, or even correspondence to, the decline of what traditionally might call discipline or disciplinary institutions. We may know from someone like the work of Michel Foucault, for example.
Let me take a crack at this one first. So the Burnout Society is certainly one of these short, interventionist, almost manifesto-like books, explicitly written for a popular audience, written for everyone. And I think it's true when you read Han, you get a feeling that these are urgent things that he wants to communicate to all sorts of people. This isn't a philosopher writing to philosophers. It might help to know that in Han's book, Agony of Eros, he distinguishes philosophy from theory. Philosophy is thinking about thinking, he says. This is at a, you see him say this when he travels to some design institute in Budapest, and he's giving a commencement address. He says that philosophy is thinking about thinking, and his philosophy books tend to be a lot more ruminative. Where does philosophy start? What's the basic mood for philosophy? He says theory in Agony of Eros cuts a clearing of differentiation. So the way that a poet might have poetic license to exaggerate, Han thinks that theorists have theoretic license to oversimplify. And in fact, in this age of big data, so Burnout Society is right before a kind of digital turn, a media studies turn, where Han has a ton of books that come out on the digital in the 2010s. Burnout Society is 2010. It's right at the cusp of that. And so he thinks there's so much data out there, Baudrillard, there's this obesity of data. We all live in our own worlds of facts. We can come up with any pattern we want. We need theory more than ever. We need to oversimplify. We need to take this license to kind of provoke thinking. So he gives himself that license, and then his theoretical books are often very stark, very dialectical, very few exceptions. Burnout Society is a great example. And his follow-up book that I think a lot of your listeners would be maybe even more interested in, Topology of Violence, sort of follows this and gives a sort of theoretical justification for it. But Han is arguing that when you begin that book, he says we're going from an immunological age to an age of infarction or a neurological age. Our diseases are even changing. We're going from a disciplinary society of Foucault, barracks and factories and repression, outside forces shaping the soul, to a permissive society of gyms and glass building where we exploit ourselves. And Han has this term positive violence for what he calls the intrapsychic, when we put pressure on ourselves. And then in Burnout Society and in later books, Han has an argument that increasingly what all of us, I think, call neoliberalism, in Han's view, is a stage of positive violence. It's just everyone doing exactly what they want. But instead of being freedom that actually feels free or is sort of substantial, it's this license or permission to exploit ourselves that's then facilitated by data and algorithms that are always sort of harvesting things. So Han is very brusque with Foucault. That was then. This is now. You're out, buddy. I'm in. That sort of stuff. Later in Psychopolitics and later books, I think he walks that back and nuances that a little bit. But I think it's just important to preface this by saying, if you read that Agnew stuff, he thinks this kind of oversimplification is necessary because there's just way too much out there to think about unless you're advancing some clear dialectical argument. Positive violence, negative violence in the case of Burnout Society.
Yeah, I think that Burnout Society is the key example here, because it is his most manifesto-like book, and that opposition between the disciplinary society and the achievement society is never starker in Han's work than it is in that book. And what we're trying to sort of make the case about with his approach to theory as kind of this shocking hyperbole is that obviously, and he sort of recognizes later works, the disciplinary society is still there, right? There's all kinds of ways in which this is very much overstated. Because I mean, in the Burnout Society, he just doesn't say that this paradigm shift's happening. He acts it like it's already happened, right? That the disciplinary societies in the past, that our threats aren't diseases anymore, and then of course COVID happens, a decade later, and that doesn't read so well. It might be hard for some readers to make it past the first few pages of the Burnout Society. But I think what he's trying to do with that overstatement is to get us to sort of pay attention to some things that are pervasive for a lot of people in their experience, but easily missed. So for instance, a lot of people check their email compulsively, work, personal email, and it might not be because their boss is putting pressure on them to do that. It's that they've got a few moments and it feels like, oh yeah, I can get a quick hit from doing that, or I can take care of business quickly, right? Or there's just all this ways where, getting stuck in sort of like a scrolling loop where you just scroll and scroll and scroll until you're exhausted, click link after link after link. Or even things that I think where we see, and probably make a case for in our book, some hybridization for sure between the disciplinary society and achievement society, like the gig economy, right? That's pretty darn exploitative in many cases. But it's also, in a way, it works because a fair number of people involved in it kind of get their kicks off of building off those ratings, trying to get a higher score, the hustle side of it. And I think he helps us to see that there isn't just exploitation going on here. There's also something about how we have adopted this performance project mindset that is very easily. It's very good for business, right? It does facilitate real exploitation, but we're at least to some degree doing it to ourselves, and that's, I think, what he wants us to see in the Burnout Society. And I think there's something to that. I mean, I definitely think it's overstated, but I think that's a real phenomenon.
Thanks for coming on the show again, both of you, Rob and Steve. Reading the chapter on the Burnout Society, it presents us with a very strong claim right at the very beginning that Byung-Chul Han is a thinker of positivity in a very unique way. And given the interlocutors or mediators that he works with in his work, namely folks like Deleuze and Foucault, and I would even go all the way back to Nietzsche, these three thinkers of positivity. How do you see Byung-Chul Han's thinking of the positive as being perhaps not only metaphysically different, but also how does all of that cash out with respect to his theorization of something like the control society or post-control society?
One pitfall, I think, when you're reading Han, but I think I fell into when I began reading him, you're trying to piece together all these books. I don't think the word positivity in Han has a particularly jargony significance. I think it basically means the equivalent of having a positive attitude. It's the opposite of negativity, and negativity comes from others or what is not you, which is quite different, as I point out in the book, than the way Foucault certainly uses the word positive. He responds in many ways to Foucault and to Deleuze, maybe in Deleuze in particular, in Topology of Violence, where he's very suspicious of sort of Deleuze's schizoanalysis, which will just be sort of freedom, because he thinks about this positive violence as the more we're free to do, the more we'll exhaust ourselves. Sometimes this incredulous question pops up as you're reading Han, I think, which is what could really be wrong with giving people opportunities to do things they want to do? What's wrong with that? And encouraging them and saying, you got it, buddy, do whatever you want to do. And Han's answer to that is that means we live in a society of tiredness. Burnout Society's German title is Müdigkeitsgesellschaft. We tire ourselves out. And if you live in a world of permission with no negativity, you'll just tire yourself out. So when he critiques Agamben's book Nudity on porn and eros, he says, look, at least when you read Bataille, there are rituals of Bataille's holy eroticism. There's something to push back against that gives you kind of a duration. Hegel's maybe a useful figure to think here, that freedom is being oneself in the space of the other. There needs to be something that pushes back against you that's not you, or all of the freedom you have will eventually be meaningless. And you might think about this as a sort of like Zen criticism of capitalism, where your desires are what are ultimately the problem, right? Weird, maybe place to be. I'm not sure if someone needs that in their arsenal or something like that. Let's see. So Foucault, we talked a little bit about Foucault, about disciplinary and achievement society, how he's kind of brusque. The response to Nietzsche is maybe the weirdest of all. Han's relationship to Nietzsche is super strange. If a reader reads like the end of his book, What is Power? The Nietzsche here is the Nietzsche who loves the autumn of the North because leaves fall and autumn doesn't want. And Han thinks Nietzsche has sort of encountered a world beyond power, which is a really weird way to read Nietzsche, and means you're just picking a few things out of the Nachlass or something like that. It's not even Heidegger's Nietzsche. It's even more mystical or something like that. So I'm not exactly sure what to do about his relation to Nietzsche in particular, other than to flag it and say, hey, that's pretty weird. Go check that out. But he just thinks that if we have nothing pushing back against us, our freedom, it'll ultimately be meaningless, because we have finite capacities for freedom, and we'll just wear ourselves out.
There's a lot more I could say on sort of the philosophical side, but bringing it back to like the social ills, I think he's trying to address. It might be something like the deformations you see in relationships online, where instead of just having a normal exchange with someone, you really want them to like and reshare your content, right? So it becomes kind of a project that you're engaged in, or you become sort of so careerist that every time you're going out, it's like a networking opportunity. And then afterwards, you're assessing how people have perceived you, whether you made a connection that might be useful, whether you heard a connection, instead of just having kind of, real exchanges with other people, where it's not always referring back to your life project, but it's actually opening yourself up to other people, having a relationship that's sometimes lower stakes, sometimes more ethically rich, but a whole range of possibilities beyond the project, which he sees more and more relationships being turned into, and the digital really facilitating that.
In terms of the digital facilitating it, I mean, can we get into this idea of how Han thinks about the digital, and particularly in terms of the ways in which it has an influence or an impact, or it maybe channels certain kinds of desire? Because, in a sense, yes, our desires are the problem. We can do whatever we want. We just can't want whatever we want. In that sense, in the same way that Schopenhauer says, you can do what you will, but you can't will what you will. And does Han have a kind of account in which he's trying to make us reflect upon our desires, or is it in a sense in which they're being reflected upon general structures in which the desire is produced? I mean, because in terms of the way you've both spoken about his method here, in terms of the idea of theory, his more theoretical books, there's something that really reminds me of, and particularly the works of like a documentarian like Adam Curtis, in particular. And particularly the method is a kind of conceptual narrativization of a sequence of stories as to how we got here, so as to kind of break us out of that immediate relation to how we got here. Essentially, by the time we get to the end of the story, we know we got here this way, and therefore we can now think about how it could have gone differently in terms of the plot or the narrativization of our lives of individual subjects. And of course, the medium does promote this to some extent, because books have gone from being a very communal aspect of human life, back in medieval period when in Europe, when people would predominantly hear books being read to them. Now everyone is an individual consumer. You can buy them at the airport, etc., etc. This individualization of desire is clearly something built into Han's method. And I want to ask how does Han think about our desires in a sense? And is it individualized? Does it need to be individualized for the kind of the medium in which he's operating? And how does the digital feed into this? Because as you say, it's the digital is a individualizing thing, because every site, internet sites now are predominantly platforms. Platforms require an account. Accounts are by their very nature individualized, especially in terms of verifying them. So how do we tackle that through a critical lens in terms of Han? Yes, Steve, please go for it.
Yeah, I might take the lead on that. So as Rob mentioned earlier, our third co-author that couldn't be with us, Ethan Stoneman, he makes a strong case that Han has this digital turn after the burnout society. And I think that's where you see him being more attuned to the ways that the disciplinary and the achievement interrelate, or the sort of more traditional power structures might use our propensity for achievement online, for data harvesting, things like that. So I think that's an important point right there, that if you've only read The Burnout Society and you're interested in technology, you should read a later book like In the Swarm or Infocracy to get really a Han that's grappling with the conversations around media theory and digital technology at a high level. The question about desire, I really like how you framed that. Just a broad point about Han is that Han, politically can sound more conservative or more progressive, but I think he's hard to pin down that way. But it's very clear to me, at least, that his ultimate goal is some sort of cosmopolitanism. So when he's arguing that we want to recover negativity, he doesn't think we want to turn back the clock to some sort of authoritarian state. That's clear. I mean, he's very clear about that in his writings. So it's not that that we haven't sort of created more possibilities for freedom in certain ways in certain places. It's that there's this final step that freedom's a trap unless we figure out a way to manage our desires in such a way that we don't just end up burning out on our projects or being instrumentalized, exploited, unbeknownst to us. I think he thinks that a lot of this exploitation happens below the level of awareness, in that psychopolitics sense, that the algorithm's always tailored to you based on what you're positively clicking without thinking about. And there it's giving you nudges at a deeper level than you're aware of. But your positive role in that is what he really wants to underscore in a lot of places. He's very tech pessimist to kind of jump around in various parts of his project. I certainly think that there's more room for real community, real friendships to form online. What Ethan argues is that he's not a tech determinist, but Ethan uses this term from the Canadian media theorist Harold Innis, a digital bias, right? So these technologies push us in a certain direction. They push us towards these relationships that are more a project. They push us away from substantive political debate or discussion towards outrage mobs that quickly dissipate and that often sort of become almost festive in the bad sense rather than substantive, targeting random people, things like that. He talks about that in The Swarm. So the biases all sort of push these ways. I guess one question that would be, what would an alternative relationship to the digital look like? Han doesn't say a lot about that, but that's an interesting thought.
When you feel burned out by whatever it is you want to do in the first place, Han thinks you turn on yourself with a kind of self-reproach. So one of his more provocative arguments, I think, in the Burnout Society is that modern depression is different than melancholy in the past. Because when you feel like the things you wanted and pursued, your projects in life don't go the way you wanted, you have no one to blame but yourself. And this sort of self-reproach belongs to positive violence and suicidal depression. The epidemic of suicidal depression that we have across the West is sort of a new thing, or this is sort of a new character. It's not grinding poverty forcing you into that. It's not oppression forcing you into that. And so you have this sort of self-reproach. I want to circle back to when you said we can do what we want, but we can't want what we want. I think for Han, the proliferation of wants facilitated by the internet is this problem. We have more wants than ever, and we can satisfy them more than ever. So if you want to get together with some dudes and talk Han, might be hard in your little rural Ohio town or whatever, but we got this, and the digital facilitates it, and it's cool. And right, this is my project, so we're in this world, right? But we can burn the very fact that we can satisfy more of our wants or launch more projects to pursue more of these wants, all of which are facilitated, tracked by the digital, right? Lord knows what the algorithms are going to try to sell me for, writing a book on Han, probably some, Zen meditation stuff or whatever. Who knows what's the algo is going to pop up with. But the fact that we can pursue more of these wants is what leads us into this burnout project. I think the key thing here is time consciousness, that if your life is just a series of projects and wants that you have, who knows what my next book will be? Who knows what my project will be in the future? Then Han thinks that time just whizzes by. He has this important concept of dyschronicity. This, I think, connects to those concerns about narrative from your original question. If my life is just pursuing one project, my wants one after another, do you think I talk with my wife about Byung-Chul Han? Like, no way. Or my kids, right? Not at all. So I'm doing this with you all, but maybe I'll do something, have another interest that'll be next, which will be totally different. And I'm not sort of forced to inhabit time with other people where we mark time in the same way. This is the way that Han begins to lament the loss of grand narratives. And he comes close, I think, almost to much more conservative figures who'll say, this is the grand narrative we need to go back to. Han never does that. But Han has this idea that we just don't share time together because of this problem of dyschronicity. So he thinks about it, I think, in this different way. But he says, time just whizzes by for us. We don't linger, and this is our problem. And it's created very weird politics in our time, and it also creates really weird pathologies in our time.
This makes sense in terms of the latest book on Block, by the way, because of Block's theories of there being a different non-synchronicity. But sorry, Steve, do you want to get on that?
Just one quick thing I would say is that in this new narrative book that came out just recently, there on this very question of grand narratives, he offers Kant and universal peace as a more promising grand narrative, right, that we might sort of try to recover. So, I think I think he is trying to. He's very indebted to Heidegger, but he definitely wants to sort of whatever he recovers from Heidegger also needs to be a critique of Heidegger's politics, I think is what he's trying to do, of course.
The book that you were mentioning, Adam, earlier is the new Spirit of Hope, which will come out later this year, where he does engage with Ernst Bloch. It's a very different book than the Burnout Society. It's World War, pandemic, these things that are not present in Achievement Society, Burnout Society might have been written at the so-called end of history, but this is a very different book, and very different concerns. It starts with a lot of Eagleton. Optimism isn't hope, because hope has to envision a future that it doesn't quite understand, a future of negativity and difference. You hope for something new. You hope for something different. And then he goes back to Mark Fisher's capitalist realism and says, this is the way Fisher reads Children of Men, this collective depression, because nothing new, right, in the film or in the book, right? No new children are entering the world. So nothing new is going to happen. The future will just be more of the same, more of my desires and projects freely chosen. Time will keep whizzing or something like that. But we're not all headed to some, unexpected future together. And he argues that fear, this is a really odd thing, because I think about fear as negativity. But Han in this book is thinking about fear as what's trapping us in achievement society. Fear because we're not able to sort of hope for a future that might be different. We're not able to hope for a future where we might be changed as individuals or as a people. We might not be changed by love or by boredom. And so we therefore lack future, or in the Derrida, like Lavinier sense, right? We only have a future of more of the same, hell of the same into the future. And that brings him to Fisher. I think it might be the first time that he cites Fisher in a book, at least that I can remember, is in this upcoming book. So I see these sort of, it's the very gloomy Fisher of capitalist realism, granted, but still he's looking forward to the book's about hope. Maybe there are some political possibilities we can start to think to.
I think that there's something kind of interesting about Han's critiques of Foucault and Deleuze, in as much as what he seems to posit as criticisms, he sometimes also takes up the metaphysical presuppositions of these societies. So he's like, we're no longer in a disciplinary society. We're in this achievement-based society. And then he kind of accepts the substance of the disciplinary society as real, especially as it pertains to like the kinds of people that the achievement society can imagine that the disciplinary society couldn't, like pill popping high achievers, or if we take into account the way in which Byung-Chul Han accepts, say, the energetics of tiredness and so on. These were things that 19th century theorists were already using to organize the disciplinary society. This is why Foucault turns to La Métrie and Leibniz, and not the Napoleonic drill sergeants. And I'm wondering, there's this element of Byung-Chul Han where he's like, okay, theory has to make these clear cuts where I can just free myself from the blackmail of the history of philosophy and just shoot forward this new idea. But there seems to be always this risk in Byung-Chul Han of accepting accepting conditions that other theorists that he's criticizing were not so quick to just say, okay, yeah. Because for both Foucault and Deleuze, like for Deleuze, he'll say no, like he's got an entire ontological critique that he calls machinic subjection, right? That has to be put in place first before human beings can then be understood as all of the things that Han is saying they are now. So, like, what's a way that we can engage with Byung-Chul Han without having to necessarily say, accept all of these things that Byung-Chul, like, because we say, oh, well, he's indebted to Heidegger. I don't see it, because he's a deeply metaphysical thinker. I don't see it at all, in fact. And this return to a Kantian cosmopolitanism and a Kantian peace sort of speaks to a desire to return to a substantive account of the human being that maybe some of the thinkers that he's in the tradition of would have been less satisfied with. So what are some ways that like we can engage with Han while sort of maybe not wanting to lose the critical aspects of the things that Han tries to shake off really quickly?
Yeah, I want to take on your sort of stronger critique of Han there, that the critique that he's criticizing these thinkers and then pilfering them at the same time. And I might want to actually kind of dogpile first and then come up with a response. But maybe I'll say a bit of, I think there's a kind of a rigorous, I would argue, maybe Steve disagrees, but I would argue there's a fairly rigorous separation between his philosophical works and his theoretical works. And there's less of a blending between the two than we might expect. And in my mind, it's the philosophical works which announce the concerns, and then the theoretical works try to provoke those concerns in people or something like that. So to dogpile, in an early book, it's from the early 2000s, Totalitarität, Han seems to be in this mode where all of Western philosophy is just cooked by the fact that it insists upon a dramatic encounter with death. And from the Phaedo, where, from Socrates and the Phaedo to Heidegger and Levinas, this need for the individual to be an individual is something that marks Western philosophy. That's something, of course, we might think that Deleuze, escapes from, but Deleuze isn't present in this part of Totalitarität. Han instead is making a move to Zen. And he argues that really we should just accept the fact that our soul is a guest house for the world. The world is an impermanent scattering of things. We're part of it. It's part of us. You realize that you're not really a self. Then you already undergo the great death in Zen, and then you're just sort of chill. And if Heidegger could be more Zen and people could be more chill, they'd be able to live anywhere, and Western philosophy wouldn't have all of these problems. Okay, now skip ahead to the books where, Vita Contemplativa or later books where Han is really working with the Romantics. And then you say, wait a minute, right? Is he at the end of the day a sort of Zen boredom, in his philosophical works, or does he really think that some encounter with the other whom we would die for, or the other in whom we die because we receive ourselves as, I only have self-knowledge as the gift of the other, this really romantic or Platonic, I don't know, he's in the Agony of Eros, he's citing Ficino, but it's also Novalis. So which is it? I mean, here's the dramatic encounter of death later. And so that's in his philosophical works. I kind of sometimes have that frustration, right? That I'm not sure if he's making a radical break with all Western philosophy like Heidegger tried to do. And I see why he thinks Heidegger is insufficient. And I see the move to Zen, but now I don't see it in the later works, right? That's my frustration, though, is with his philosophical works. I think the almost brusqueness with which he's dealing with Deleuze and Foucault is actually quite uncharitable, because there I don't think he's really dealing philosophically with difference and repetition, or even Deleuze as a metaphysician. I just think if this is your theory of how schizophrenia works, then it just feeds into positive violence, and this is a problem, and you're never going to become aware of my philosophical concerns if that's how if that's your theory, if those are the clear-cut distinctions you're making in the world of politics. So I think I share a lot of your frustrations. I share it with what I take to be his when he's doing philosophy. And then part of what I would present as a way to engage with Han is trying to make this demarcation. Like, when is he thinking about thinking? Like, how is it possible to think freely? How is it possible to act freely? And Freundlichkeit is part of that. He says that's the central concept. And anywhere that he's thinking about Freundlichkeit, like the other and eros as a transcendental possibility of thought itself, that seems to be his philosophical stuff. If he's not doing that, I think it's, then we're dealing with like a dialectic he's set up in advance, and he's motoring and pushing people aside in kind of ways that, you're going to find uncharitable, but that's not where he's doing the philosophy, I'd say. So that would be a way that you might develop a slightly more appreciative reading of what he's trying to do. Or not, if you don't find the theorists that, the philosophers that you would really like to be in the philosophical works there, then you'd say, well, hey, you're dealing with thinkers who have a lot more depth, but you're only dealing with them in this sort of, secondary sense that they're not really troubling you with live questions. So maybe that will help. I don't know. That's the way I tend to read it. Steve, are you the same way?
Yeah, I think very similar. I think that there's a way in which he tends to push hardest at times on thinkers that he's closest to. And I think that can be really frustrating thing. Baudrillard and he share so much, but at times he'll just sort of push so hard and say, I'm just entirely different. Foucault, does he not attend to something like positive violence in his account of biopolitics? I think that's actually pretty I think he's more attuned to some of these problems than Han lets on. A thinker I've been spending a lot of time with recently, Hartmut Rosa. I mean, that guy has to really be frustrated with Han. As far as I know, they don't cite each other except once Han is really nasty towards Rosa in like a aside. But Rosa too is interested in burnout, and he points out two reasons for burnout that I think are quite compelling. One is that I feel like we're in a rapidly changing society where it's easy to fall behind. So they're worried about getting kicked off the hamster wheel. So they work and work and work to try to just maintain in a time of precarity for many people. 100%. That's obviously just right. Rosa also says that people push themselves to burnout because they want to extend their share of the world, which is closer to what Rosa thinks is a good thing, achieving these relationships of resonance. And I think both of those are worth thinking about a lot and are important supplements. But I think that at the end of the day, Han wants to draw attention to a third thing that's not exactly the same as either of those. That's like that compulsive, compulsive scrolling on Twitter. It's hard for me to see that as really trying to extend your share of the world in the kind of way that Rosa paints it in the book Resonance, right? It is some other kind of positive violence that you're doing to yourself. So, I mean, I think that you put the two thinkers together and you have three very persuasive positions. But Han's going to give you one really pronounced take, right? And sort of push against all other people. And that can be frustrating. And it'll be interesting to see in the uptake of the secondary literature. I think that we'll see some scholars that take the new contributions that Han does make, and I think he does, and sort of integrate them into a fuller picture, like you just did in your question so nicely. And those that just can't get past the way that he, plays fast and loose with his interlocutors. I expect we'll see both. And I understand both responses, actually. But I do think that to be the most charitable to Han, and the position I take is I do think that he's trying to deliver some sort of shock therapy in these short books, right? He's trying to shock us into seeing something we didn't otherwise.
Yeah, thank you. In addition to reading this book out now on polity, I would recommend, I've read maybe about 4 books by Byung-Chul Han. The most notable being, to me, was The Scent of Being, which came out in 2009. And here I have to push back against Will. While Han may not have the same metaphysical / ontological armature as Heidegger, I see a lot of Heidegger's concepts looming beneath the surface, especially with what he does in that book, particularly the concept of lingering. There's a kind of resonance with Heidegger's notion of reticence. I mean, even the clearing is in there a little bit. But I think the bigger concept from Heidegger that seems to pervade Han's work is a notion of authenticity. And it seems to inform, not just simply subtly, but robustly, what might be Han's politics. And before we hit record, we were talking about what are the contours of Han's politics. And I mean, first of all, do you agree that this concept of authenticity is kind of oozing through the cracks of Han's work? And if so, in what ways do you think he departs from Heidegger? And how does Han not U-turn back into a brute anti-modernism or succumb to a kind of romantic tendency that we see with some Heideggerian thought?
All right, that's a great question, a great series of questions, really. I don't think there's authenticity in Han, but there's a whole lot of Heidegger, right? And so he does his dissertation on Heidegger at Freiburg. He especially likes the late Heidegger. I think it's kind of amusing to think about a Korean graduate student at Freiburg in the 90s who really gets taken with the late Heidegger, because it's not authentic for him to get a cabin in the Black Forest, fill it with some peasant objects, sneak off to watch a little soccer, sneak back and pretend like don't do that or something. I don't know. And so he and his early books really kind of wrestle with that. One missing book that Ascent of Time is, I think, the first thing I read by Han, and maybe to this day is still my favorite thing I've read by Han. And it also, I think this is the philosophical stuff that explains the uncharitableness of the theoretical stuff, where there's almost this, what does he share with Heidegger? Some kind of apocalyptic idea that thinking will simply become impossible unless but okay, unless what? So his earliest book is called Heidegger's Heart or Heidegger's Herz, and he thinks Heidegger doesn't really um, think through and analyze boredom adequately. There's a lot of, D.T. Suzuki, there's a lot of Heidegger and Zen, sort of maybe the late Heidegger and Zen, there's a lot of interchange. Han thinks that's overstated. And Han thinks even when Heidegger even when Heidegger is analyzing moods like boredom, part of this you might just think of what is the basic mood for philosophy itself. That might be a good way to step back and think about this. And if you never get into that basic mood, thinking is impossible. So by late Heidegger, I mean, this is the Heidegger that thinks instrumental and technological rationality has overtaken everything. And all we can, if philosophy is just about thinking about self-preservation or desire or eros or something like that, then the future is only desires we can satisfy, and then we have no future. Now, for Heidegger, that's fate coming back, or some sort of collective destiny. And Han is really worried about that, because that seems to be the stuff that a fighting collectivity needs. Like, we need a German poet to remind us what being German is, or else we might as well be Soviets or Americans, totally destined by technology. Han is not about that. And I think Han is well aware that he would not be such a German. And yet he finds something in Heidegger. But he thinks Heidegger ultimately needs to find too much authenticity in boredom. Boredom is without intentionality, deep or profound boredom. So I think what he tries to do is really complete Heidegger's affinities for Buddhism, for Zen Buddhism, and to try to push him a little further beyond, I think, authenticity. Again, that's not where he stops, because there's some later Han. It's an odd way that he reads Nietzsche. Maybe in German thought, this is, if you really do a deep dive into sort of German philosophy and Jakob Böhme and so on, you'll find stuff that's kind of dying to self that's awfully like this. But I don't think this often comes to the surface in a lot of the figures that Han's dealing with. And I'm not sure that he ever quotes those figures or something like that. But he thinks boredom. Peter Handke is the sort of Nobel laureate Austrian novelist. He's always citing Peter Handke. But when Handke thinks about deep tiredness or deep boredom, it's like manual laborers that are just dog tired with one another. And they're just done even being themselves. So I think that's beyond authenticity. I think that's the way that burnout offers something like a deep tiredness that might actually be restorative, and maybe lead to hope or something beyond ourselves. But because he certainly doesn't think the answer is to go study Zen. He thinks Cezanne and Handke, all these Westerners come to these concepts too. But it's really thinking through the late Heidegger without a dramatic encounter with death, getting that out of there without angst or anxiety. And this new book is trying to say we have to get beyond fear if we want to have sort of hope for something new that will advent on us together, maybe something unexpected to struggle with. So there's a ton of Heidegger. Yeah, that's right. But I think the things that give me the willies about Heidegger give Han the willies about Heidegger. Sorry, that might be a bit of a...
No, that's a very fair statement. Steve, did you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, two ways of summing up Hans' relationship to Heidegger that we lay out in the book is that he definitely wants to draw on the Heidegger of releasement, the Heidegger of a dwelling that gives a sense of duration and time, so the time no longer whizzes by, this more contemplative Heidegger. And he wants to do that in two ways. One, by bringing Heidegger all the way through Zen. So that's also a critique of Heidegger too at the same time. So Rob touched on that, I think, in a nice way. But also in recent works, by going back to Heidegger's romantic touchstones, someone like Hölderlin and Novalis, and saying, yeah, there's a lot of interesting things in here for a contemplative relationship to the world, but their politics are very, very different than Heidegger's politics were. So critiquing Heidegger also by going back to his romantic sources and rereading them in a different direction, a more positive direction, for sure. I might disagree with Rob that I think there is a notion of authenticity implicit and loose and idiosyncratic in Han. I mean, I think that for all intents and purposes, and again, setting aside the more technical understanding of authenticity in Heidegger for a moment, and just using that notion of authenticity more broadly. I think he thinks to think of your life as a project is inauthentic, but many people think it is authentic, right? And you will not flourish that way. You will not have existential fulfillment that way. You will become shaped by all these forces that you are embracing. And I think that what is authentic for him is not a self as much as it is a releasing of the ego into an open relationship with the world and others. Right? I think he thinks that's where existential fulfillment's to be found and where ethical fulfillment's to be found.
Well, you're just wrong, because he's looking for yourself as a gift from the other. And that's the opposite of Eigentlichkeit, right? It's the opposite of I'm dying alone. It's me. You're not dying with me, honey. You're not me, right? It's the opposite of, I think, angst. I don't know. I mean, this we can parse authenticity in all sorts of ways.
Well, that's why I set aside Heidegger's technical definition. My point is that when he's talking about the inauthentic seems very much the subtext of much of what Han writes, I think.
If you're worried about authenticity in the Adorno way, that searching for authenticity is going to be deep mystical sources of meaning that you really know what they are and share with others, and that's going to completely paralyze any kind of cosmopolitan politics, I think Han is already on the other, has digested that critique. And yes, there is maybe a wanting to discover who you are, but that has to be a gift from the other. That has to be who you are in an ultimately unknowable future. And it begins with sort of like loosening the clamps on yourself. Like all of this Zen stuff is trying to just get you beyond any concern with who you are as opposed to the rest of the world. So yeah, very purposely loose and idiosyncratic, maybe. Maybe less, I mean, it's not forget who we are and let's just do material politics, right? So, I mean, I know that's probably much more congenial to a lot of people on the left. Han isn't doing that either. And to that degree, I jumped on Steve too hard, maybe then, fine. But there is there is this sort of crisis of meaning that, that Han thinks really is a problem and really does, why am I so depressed? Why do I burn myself out? Why do I only think of my life as the wants I will have in the future? That Han really thinks that this is the reason for the sort of pandemic of depression and burnout all around us. So that matters to him for sure. But the answer isn't to sort of discover the sort of mystical being that will reveal who you are, as opposed to anyone else. And so I have a little bit more of the Adorno allergy to the word authenticity, but I think Han always strikes me as responsive to that.
As both sort of a theoretician and an ontologist, he seems to move away from the late Heideggerian question of what is called thinking to what is called friendship. And I want to pick up this term that you first brought up, Rob, which is in German Freundlichkeit, friendliness, which seems to be in some scriptures I've heard described as Han's ontology of freedom to some extent, a new way of thinking about freedom rather than simply as the absence of constraints. And he thinks that absence in a way has become quite oppressive in a roundabout way for his idea of positive violence. I just want to ask you both, what does Han mean by Freundlichkeit or friendliness, and how does that sort of configure his idea of an alternative to the relations which confront us today, particularly insofar as, I mean, he's always addressing individual readers to some extent, or people who he knows have been individualized. And of course, we've been speaking all this time about these kind of Derridian, Levinasian inflections of getting yourself back from the other, this cosmopolitan thing of you cannot posit yourself as a kind of project. I mean, positing yourself as a project. Sorry, I'll repeat that in a more colloquial term. You cannot be your own grind set. This must be a collective project. It must be a relation established between the relata, which de-individualize themselves in being related. I've returned to Kierkegaard here. But what do we mean by when Han says Freundlichkeit, when he says friendship as this kind of ontological freedom or ontological attitude?
So he calls this the, kind of in correspondence, has said this was the central aspect of his thought. He asked when we were corresponding with him early on, pitching the book, some of these conversations mediated through polity, feeling out whether he would how he would feel about having a book, since they obviously also seem to publish all of the translations now. He asked us some easy softball questions, and then he said, well, what do you think the central concept of my thinking is? And I forget exactly what we said, but something like receptivity to others, no, it's Freundlichkeit. Now, I probably think that Freundlichkeit, which he also says is very difficult to translate, probably means something like receptivity to others, being friendly. I think Freundlichkeit is an aspect of many different moods. So if we think about what the basic mood is for philosophy, moods that of self-assertion, or moods of recoiling into ourselves, like fear or desire being self-assertive, and fear maybe recoiling into us, aren't particularly friendly moods, because they're not open to see the ways that others constitute who we are. Boredom is a little friendlier because you're released from your own intentions. What Han calls eros, which is hoping to see oneself as a gift of the other or allowing the other to be who they are, that's a friendly mood. So it strikes me that there are a different range of attunements or moods. And I think he never defines it like this, but of course I'm a bit of a nudnik, so I need definitions. I think Freundlichkeit is an aspect of certain moods. I think he thinks of them as the moods that get short shrift in philosophy. And he also thinks of them as the moods that will save us from depression and burnout today. So in the philosophical works, I think they try to develop, okay, how do we linger? How do we establish, how do we find Freundlichkeit? There's boredom, there's eros, and there seems to be now futurity, like a real unexpected future. This seems to be a new thing popping up, but related. And then in the theoretical works, if he thinks the theorist isn't getting you to this kind of friendliness, they're out, right? Because we need this, right? But the motivation comes from trying to find this kind of attunement. I think he thinks we're healthier with them. And I think he thinks that I know he thinks that we're freer with them. So he does an etymology of freedom, of Freiheit and Freundlichkeit. He wants to argue that these are, that we are free when we are among friends. We are free when we are allowed to be who we are and allow others, when we let the world free from our desires and purposes. We're free from, you might think about, again, Heidegger's technological predetermination of all things because something went wrong in the mists of time in Western philosophy or something like that. Kant seems to think that that's true to some degree. It's not, but instead of waiting for fate, or instead of waiting for being to appear in language, some poet or something like that, we can learn in all sorts of ways to have more friendliness in our life. We can learn it from eros and from love. We can learn it from gardening. We can learn it from contemplation and ritual. And that's when the books they come fast and they come from all sorts of angles. I don't like thinking about it as therapeutic, right? I also have this sort of allergy to the word therapeutic, because I think about the therapeutic as the thing that makes you functional within the system that made you miserable in the first place, and that ultimately sustains the system, right? So the triumph of the therapeutic always makes me a little nervous, right? Much like, schizoanalysts and others, I'm sure. But I think friendliness has to be a real dilation to the world beyond that. And then the theoretical works aren't just to make you feel better, to function better. The theoretical works, I think, are trying to provoke something like Freundlichkeit, although he thinks Freundlichkeit can be found in many different ways. And then you have all of these books written on all of these topics. But I think in all of them, he's heading towards something like Freundlichkeit. And I think that might also be the key to some of the inconsistencies. Like maybe at the end of the day, he doesn't really care what you think about Plato, or if Levinas gets it right or wrong, or the Romantics. Maybe there are many ways to develop this attunement, and he's kind of fine with rolling any of them out. I mean, that would be very convenient for philosophers not have to be consistent. But maybe that, in his heart of hearts is where he is.
I think probably the best cheap shot from really smart people that I've seen of Han is some sort of one-liner that's like, it's high theory self-help. There's something to that, but as Rob just pointed out, it's precisely not self-help, because the whole answer is to loosen the screws on yourself, right? To get out of the ego, sort of. But I also think it's really important to just sort of face head on. And I'm kind of surprised Han doesn't say more about this. He does note it. But a lot of the things that are the cures for Han, the kind of contemplative attunement, are also things that can be very much instrumentalized. You know, the office can offer yoga. The office can offer meditation, right? All in the service of heightened achievement. I don't think that's a defeater of him, but I do think it's very important to note that for these things to do the things that Han wants them to do, they really do have to exit you out of that project-based efficiency, productivity mindset.
So, just one final question as we're coming up towards the hour. I know, of course, people should start with, of course, Byung-Chul Han, the critical introduction, out now from Polity Press. But if people wanted to start on a sort of a Byung-Chul Han journey, the first film from Byung-Chul Han, particularly in light of the wider planetary crises, the acceleration of digital technology, the rise of so-called AI, which I'll remind the audience is neither A nor I, where would people start with the work of someone like Byung-Chul Han? Where would you recommend someone get their first hit of friendship, so to speak?
There's a great documentary film that's free on YouTube by Isabella Grasser, Byung-Chul Han, Müdigkeitsgesellschaft in Seoul and Berlin, English subtitles, and that's great. I think that's worth it to get a kind of sense of his personality and concerns, and a little bit more of a little bit more color than the books sometimes give. And I think it's just great. And did a wonderful job with that. The other thing I would say is that, you know, as Steve and I, as a matter of fact, have a piece coming out soon. The magazine is The Philosopher. It's a UK magazine that does a lot of popular philosophy, saving philosophy from the academy, I guess, the tagline, that we've entitled 5 Ways of Reading Byung-Chul Han. So people are interested in different things, I've noticed, and Han writes books about a lot of different things. And so we've tried to sort of inventory different ways of getting into Han. So in the critical introduction, we start with the Burnout Society because it's the smash hit. In this piece, we started with hyperculture, right? About Han navigating being a Korean German philosopher, how he does that, and how he thinks that we live in a globalized world that's almost his idea of hyperculture is that you're beyond any culture. You're eating fusion foods. You're assimilating things from different cultures all the time. No problem. The book, in some ways, is it's 2005. It's quite early. It's his first real theoretical. It's kind of a what is globalization? Can we be happy anywhere, or do we need to feel rooted in order to be happy? That's kind of the question. Heidegger's at the end. There's the deep ambivalence about Heidegger is there. So it's this great book of someone that had been writing academic tomes on Heidegger that's now writing about globalization. Of course, a Korean, someone that lives in Seoul and Berlin and thinks about these things. So that's a great book to sort of get another way to get a kind of the measure of Han. And it's set up against post-colonialism and this idea that all cultural interactions are unfriendly or relations of domination. So this idea that it's pure positivity, you can take some, fusion food, Asian fusion food, and then put Mexican hot sauce. There's no. You can read philosophers from other cultures; they become part. Maybe you watch some. You have your digitally facilitated anime club that you spend all of your life and money on, or something like that. It's fine. It's how it is. We live in this sort of hyperculture now, where there's no culture. And there are different sort of nationalist reactions against globalization, and then high-minded, globalization's great and universal human rights stuff, but that doesn't really get at this just friendly mixtures that are happening everywhere, and how to be friendly, sort of no matter where you live. That's another way to enter into him. But we have 4 more in that little introduction. It's a really hard question that you ask, right? Because it's a really hard question because Han writes so many books about so many different things. I mean, now more than 30. And depending on what you're interested in, for a lot of us in the political theory and philosophy worlds, and he's got a book on that. He's got a book on beauty, and he's got a book on contemplation, and on gardening, and on the pandemic, and and et cetera, et cetera. So, but that piece might be good. the Burnout Society feels a bit dated now. I think it is a kind of a classic book and a great provocation. But as Steve says, I think it's hard to get through those opening pages if you're picking it up for the first time, because it doesn't, whether it's COVID or Ukraine or whatever, we just don't seem like we live in a world where it's just our projects all the time. And that's the real problem. It's like reading Francis Fukuyama or something like that. There might be a point there, but we're not in the mood for that right now.
I'll be really concrete, because I used to think that The Scent of Time was my entry point. I really do love this book. I still think it's a great one. I think he says some things in there that he doesn't say the same way elsewhere. It's good. But I think the place that I tend to recommend readers begin now is this one called Non-Things, because this is it's called Non-Things. I think it came out maybe 2019. I'll quickly take a look. 2021, 22. So it's even newer than I thought it was. It's a great book because he's basically arguing, via Hannah Arendt, that we're losing these things that stabilize our lives, concrete things, material things. They're being replaced by digital devices that don't stabilize, they destabilize. So you get Han's digital critique in there. You get a nice overview of his contemplative response. I think you get more nuance on the disciplinary versus the achievement subject, because it's a later work. And then you have this awesome chapter at the end that's autobiographical in a way that he rarely is, where he talks about this jukebox he has in an apartment that's basically empty except for the jukebox and a grand piano. And he has these crazy lyrical descriptions of this jukebox and how much it means to him. And I don't know, but I really liked that. I found it very winsome.
Acid Horizon listeners, right? It's from a lot of the threads that this wonderful and often very informative podcast picks up, right? Like the Bataille thread, right? Agony of Eros, you got his engagement with Bataille. The Deleuze and schizoanalysis stuff, there's a critique of that in Topology of Violence. I think Topology of Violence, which is a bit longer and sort of fleshes out the Burnout Society. Like, that can be, again, quite brusque. I mean, that's sort of critical. And then this new book, Spirit of Hope, that's coming out, where he has the concerns of Mark Fisher that sort of made 0 books, and he's registering them and kind of working through them again. And I think that shows him to be a more sympathetic figure than the figure that's sort of furiously criticizing Deleuze in Topology of Violence. But those might be 3 that a lot of your will either make your listeners furious or that they would find quite sympathetic. But sometimes we enjoy reading things that make us furious too. So negativity being a good thing.
Yeah, maybe I'll say one thing on that. Will and I commiserated on our reading of Byung-Chul Han in that we're very interested in the broad themes. We're interested in the questions he's presenting and often the framing, but it's often the vagaries within the text itself. And you had said at the top of this episode that he's probably making provocative statements to be provocative. And I think it's not necessarily that I'm being toyed with, but I'm confronting a series of, in a sense, kind of disjoint provocative statements embedded in these arguments where I don't always agree with the secondary premises, but I'm rooting for him the whole time. And it's certainly a challenge. And in that sense, I think reading Byung-Chul Han, he's a really good mediator in that sense. If you've read Deleuze, you've read Foucault, Bataille, Heidegger, and those folks, now you have somebody in the contemporary moment operating within those registers that you can really tarry with.
And it's going to be a lot easier to pick up one of his books and read it than working through Deleuze,
yeah,
and then working through Foucault. So you might not get the whole picture. And so you absolutely have to buy our book. That's I know the consensus of all reasonable people of goodwill and of discerning taste around the world. But there is that way that you pick it up. It's an afternoon. It makes you think something you haven't thought. You put it down. You learn, I think, to tarry with them a little more and get a bit more of the complete picture.
One of the things that I think the critical introduction as a sort of critical apparatus helps with, especially when I was working through the section on the Burnout Society here, is how you folks do 2 things. Is first start to parse out this really strange reading of like Nietzsche, but more importantly, the aspect of like, where is economy in Byung-Chul Han? And I think for a lot of people who are interested in, postmodern attempts at reanalyzing classical accounts of political economy, especially in the early pages of this book, like ranging from the sort of ecological account of Machiavelli all the way through to sort of the political economy of Hayek, like there is a sort of necessity to sort of augment these elements in Han's thinking. So for that reason, I think the critical introduction is necessary for a thinker like Han. Just because depending on what you want to come away with from him, especially if you're trying to think through these things in the framework of the political, this sort of is these augmentations of his thought or extensions are necessary, even if they're critical or charitable.
Thank you for saying that, and I appreciate it. It's the first chapter is almost all Rob's doing, but he picked on me because I'm from the middle of nowhere in America, and I kept wanting to talk about like truck drivers and surveillance disguised as safetyism, right? And all these kind of ways that you can take Han and look at the way it interfaces with the disciplinary society. And we do some of that, but I think that we just try to extend it in a lot of different directions, and I'm glad to hear that that's how it came through. One other thing I would say is that we're definitely sympathetic to Han. We like Han's thought a lot.
It's very strange to work with a thinker that you're very sympathetic to, but you have some critiques too that we want to signpost.
But then alongside this, you've read everything he's written, and you're still perplexed about some really key things, such as how do we get from extinguishing all desire, this Zen movement in the beginning, to suddenly talking about eros? We have our theories, but we don't know for certain, how exactly that works for Han. So it was an interesting project that way.
And that's why, like, the provocation of Han's thought is probably something that is necessary. Like, this is why books like this are necessary, right? Because alongside these provocations that are maybe sporadic, a sort of a secret third thing can come through. But I am interested in the truck drivers and security as safety. But I'll let that slide for now.
We have to have a part 2 at some point, but I know we've already gone past the hour, so I didn't want to take any more of your time, folks. But at the end of this now, say thank you much to Rob and Steve for coming on and joining us. And of course, Byung-Chul Han, A Critical Introduction, is out now from Party Press. And of course, on the other episodes of Party People, we'd have one a couple of days ago with, probably a couple of weeks ago by the time this comes out, with Don Petman about his book with Eugene Thacker on Sad Planets. And hopefully we continue this conversation soon another time. There's nothing else to say, but thanks again, Steve and Rob, for joining us. And thanks everyone for listening.